Are you afraid of the dark?
She sat with her back against the wall across from Clyde's room. The door hung open, and the room was empty. She had to wonder if what just happened was real. She sat lost in her thoughts for some time, unaware of herself or her surroundings, lost in oblivion. A child, trapped in the body of a man. She had to wonder now how he even ended up there. The poor thing. Her eyes stung, and her head ached almost as much as her heart did. She had to pull herself together. Needed to focus on the task at hand. Clyde was not what she came here for. She was here for Danica Bathory. She stood up slowly, her eyes pinned to the empty room in front of her. She had a sense of disbelief mingling with a sense of inescapable sorrow. But she had work to do. She came here for answers, and she wasn't leaving without them. Not this time. It took longer than anticipated to peel her eyes from Clyde's room. She almost didn't want to. She knew he was gone, knew he was finally at peace. But still, she somehow felt that if she walked away, she was abandoning him. She turned, gave the room a last look, and said goodbye to Clyde before resuming her hesitant walk toward the darkness of the corridor. It wasn't a long walk. However, the pitch blackness ahead made it seem like miles. Even though with each step the darkness moved away, frightening thought crossed her mind more than once, asking, what if it didn't this time? The frayed orange sign immediately caught her attention, making her stop so abruptly she could have screeched. Bingo, she thought. Familiar numbers scrawled on a piece of badly decomposing paper read 3122564, and the small glass window showed a room lit up like daytime. Her hands began to shake. Was she really doing this? Fear gripped her in remembrance of the last visit she had made to Danica Bathory. However insane the woman may be, she also made sense. She could barely keep hold of the keys as she shuffled through them to find, once more, the one that opened the doors on the main floor. Her hands shook so uncomfortably that she fumbled the ring and dropped them to the ground with a loud clinking sound that seemed to echo throughout the entire building. She closed her eyes and cursed herself silently before bending to pick them back up. When she stood, she was met with the pale, white face of Danica Bathory, bleak and expressionless, staring intently through the small square window of her door. Frankie screamed and slammed her back into the wall behind her, losing her breath when she did. She gripped at her chest, hoping that it would somehow slow her heartbeat enough to breathe again. Danica seemed unmoved. She simply stood there at the door, staring at her as though she knew why she was there, as though she were waiting. However disheveled the woman was, she was actually quite lovely. At 70, she looked no older than half that, save for the matted, mangled white hair that hung in her face. Her ivory white skin showed nearly no sign of her age. but her eyes reflected years of torment that had yet to be forgotten. Her age showed there, and yet nowhere else. She was beautiful, even at 70. Danica simply stood there, waiting for Frankie to regain her bearings. Frankie hesitated a moment, unsure of what she should do. Open Danica's door, or run like hell as far from this place as she could get. She'd come here with a fierce determination. A determination to get the answer she had sought for so long. A determination that she would not leave this place without them. And she knew Danica had the answer she so desperately needed. She knew she would leave here with an understanding of some kind. It took every ounce of courage she could summon to peel herself away from the tattered wall at her back. The keys in her hand were gripped so hard she could feel their teeth digging into her already sore and tender fingers. Her eyes only left Danica's long enough to gaze at the lock on her door before sliding in the key. It seemed as though every tumbler that folded under the metal was loud enough to burst her eardrums. When the door finally opened, Danica looked intently at her rescuer. "I wondered when you would come back," she said softly. "I hadn't expected you so soon." Frankie looked at her unknowingly and uncertain of what to do now. She knew she needed Danica, but now what? She almost laughed out loud at herself, realizing that she hadn't planned this far ahead. Danica hadn't moved from her brightly lit room, which confused Frankie even further. She simply stared out the door now, scanning the corridor with features near saddened, as though she anticipated but accepted some ominous truth. "You came for answers, child." Her eyes never left the length of the black corridor as she quietly spoke. "Let's go get them." The moment Danica stepped out of her room and into the dimly lit hall, every shadow around them seemed to come to life, lurching and writhing from every direction, as though desperately trying to reach out and take her. She took Frankie's hand and gently squeezed it, making Frankie wince. Danica slowly closed her eyes to the screeching darkness that seemed to rage against the confines of the shadows to consume her. With each step, the dark seemed to grow new forms, twisting in the black like some tormented wraith fighting in the shadows to stake claim on her soul. The horrific spectacle made her think of starving wolves on a helpless rabbit. Still, Danica, with her closed eyes, walked slowly in their narrow path of light, her resolve unshaken by the terror, clawing and swiping, twisted and hungry. For a moment, Frankie was stirred by her courage. She said nothing, but kept hold of the older woman's hand and followed quietly. At the end of the corridor stood a large steel door marked B-Level 1. She couldn't help but notice that there were no elevators in this wretched place. "Give me the keys." Danica spoke softly. Her voice was as steady as her resolve. Frankie silently obeyed, handing over the large ring, her eyes fixed on the walls around them. She focused in horrid disbelief at what was happening. She'd seen it before, but never this way. They had never seemed so hungry before. Why did they want her so? The ghastly figures clawing across the walls wailed and howled their demanding from black, slobbering masses that should have been mouths, but somehow were not. Frankie feared that, with one misstep into the slightest dark, she and Danica would be snatched into nothingness. She then decided at best that she paid obsessive attention to her footsteps. The door groaned open and Danica advanced, her bare feet tapping lightly on the steps as Frankie followed close behind. The bottom revealed a small room with only one door marked records. Frankie felt her confusion growing into frustration. What was she doing, she wondered. Had she made a mistake coming here after all? No, child, not a mistake. You wanted answers, and you will have them, Danica said solemnly. Frankie found herself standing frozen at that. Had she said it aloud? No, she knew she hadn't. What the hell was going on? Danica rested her head against the glass on the door, seeming almost happy to be there, like there was a long-lost love waiting for her within. She released Frankie's hand and ran it down the glass, leaving a clean white trail where her fingers had been. Cobwebs and dust fell into her pale hair. She caressed the door with her cheek. Frankie stood confused. This woman truly was mad. Frankie hadn't heard the door unlock, but Danica opened it, revealing a room covered in dust and cobwebs. The place was empty save for a few cabinets and chests, neglected and decaying. The light was sparse, but there was enough to reach the small chest just nearing the center of the room. Danica stood beneath a light that dangled precariously from its trappings. Frankie had to wonder then how it was still functional. It looked as though at any moment it would snap loose and knock Danica to the ground, but she didn't even seem to notice as she wrestled the drawer of the chest open, a cloud of dust coughing from it as it gave. Here, child, she said gently as she pulled a brown folder from its confines and laid it atop the chest. Everything you need to know is here. Frankie stared for a moment at the decrepit file. She questioned whether or not, then, that she really wanted to know. Was this the end of her journey? Were her questions truly going to be answered? And was there a way to make it all stop? She stared, unsure at the deep imprints of Danica's slender fingertips on the thick dust adorning the folder, and stepped forward, noting momentarily the slightest of smiles crossing the older woman's lips. Patient number 3122564, Danica E. Bathory. Frankie opened the thick folder and immediately fell 2 sheets of loose document, both of which would change her life completely. Certificate of live birth. Given names, Claudius Clyde Grace. Last name, Bathory. Date of birth, November 16th, 1970. Facility, Shady Acres Asylum. Place of birth, Spokane, Spokane County, Washington. Time of birth, 10:39 p.m. Sex, male. Mother's maiden name, Danica Elizabeth Bathory. Father's name, unknown. Frankie looked at Danica, her eyes wide and glossed with tears. Clyde. Was your son? Danica swayed to and fro, her arms cradled as though she were holding a baby. Her eyes were closed and a broad smile crossed her face. She looked so happy. She then simply looked at Frankie. "Keep going," she whispered. Stapled carelessly to the birth certificate was also a death certificate. Certificate of death. Given names Claudius Clyde Grace. Last name Bathory. County of death Spokane County. Date of death November 16th, 1999. Hour of death unknown. Sex male. Aged 29 years. Race white. Birth date November 16, 1970. Birthplace Shady Acres Asylum. Place of death Shady Acres Asylum. Cause of death blunt force trauma, starvation, neglect, EST, electric shock therapy. Mother Danica E. Bathory. Father unknown. Method of disposition cremation, identifiable dental. Reason remains were undiscovered for several weeks. When the patient was found, the body was in an advanced state of decomposition. Frankie wanted to choke Danica then. How could she allow this to happen to her own son? He stayed in my room with me for the first few years, but after a while they began to see that he had learning disabilities and put him in another ward. They took my boy from me. Danica's eyes began to look far away. Tears welled up in them like shards of glass, stinging until they were given release. Eventually they allowed me to stay in the same ward with him, but not the same room, so after they took him from me, I never saw him again. She closed her eyes then. Not until they killed him. It gave her a small sense of understanding. But why the cruelty? Why didn't anyone do anything about this place? Danica, She was cut off then. You wanted answers, girl. Keep going, Danica asserted. Frankie was hesitant. Second document was face down, askew of the thick file folder, and she nearly fainted when she picked it up and read it. Certificate of live birth. Given name, Frankie Lynn. Last name, Bathory. Date of birth, April 9th, 1985. Facility, Shady Acres Asylum. Place of birth, Spokane County, Washington. Time of birth, 12:01 a.m. Sex, female. Mother's maiden name, Danica Elizabeth Bathory. Father's name unknown. She felt sick. She stumbled and eventually sat down with the paper still in her hand. She leaned against the chest and watched as her tears hid the filthy floor beneath her. They took you too, Danica whispered. They wouldn't even let me say goodbye. They just stole you away before I ever even had a chance to hold you. Frankie just sat quietly, listening to her. They told me that you were with a good family, that would love and care for you. I got some comfort out of that. She was shaking, in shock. These weren't the answers she needed. This was not what she was looking for. But it is, child. These facts will lead you to the truth you seek, Danica said, as though reading her thoughts. Understand, girl, I've been in this place since 1969. I've had 2 children since then, and I've never left this place. Danica seemed to lose her train of thought then. Frankie looked up at her as a shadow hand reached into the light, caressed the older woman's face like a lover. Danica. A long and sensual whisper from the shadow as it suffered the light to touch her. The black, flaking hand began to puff and smoke, crackling and sizzling in the light in a manner that looked most painful. Danica leaned into it, as though it was something familiar and longed for. Frankie shot up and pulled at Danica's tattered gown, jerking her away from the dark. The shadow seemed to scream and growl in protest, and for a moment, Frankie was afraid. But more than afraid, she was furious, and becoming more so by the minute. In a split second, her life had completely been turned upside down. Everything she had known was a lie. All of it. There were other answers she needed now. In that moment, Danica snapped back into her senses, and Frankie's voice rang in her ears. "What happened then?" she shouted, shaking the woman. "Who's my father? An orderly? A doctor? Who? Tell me." Danica stared at her then, alarmed at Frankie's sudden outburst. "Your father," she whispered in a hushed tone. "Your father," she repeated. "Your father." Frankie shook her again, hard this time. "Just tell me." Again, Danica looked at her in shock before she spoke. "Your father is not of this world." She turned her head to the shadows as she said it. "He's of theirs." Frankie's shock increased tenfold then. She found herself staring into the darkness with Danica. She didn't know what to think, what to believe. Was Danica truly insane? Was Frankie herself insane? She simply stood there, staring at Danica in disbelief and horror. It couldn't be true. How could it? It couldn't be. She had to be crazy, but the more Frankie thought about what she'd been told, the more sense her whole life seemed to make. Everything she saw, everything she heard, it was all real. And this was why. Danica pulled her eyes away from Frankie, turned just out of reach of the blackness, seemed to churn and thrash before her like it ached for her, like it would eat her alive. "I always thought it was so strange," she began. Her tone was soft, mild, almost comforting. "The only man in this world that ever truly loved me." She hesitated before finishing, staring into the shadows as she spoke. "Was never a part of this world." She chuckled lightly, her slender fingers gently touching her lips. Frankie listened in wonder, unknowing of where this new truth would lead her, if anywhere. "I've hidden in the light for so long," she continued. Frankie watched the shadowed hand reach once more for her. "Danica!" Frankie warned, afraid that the dark would snatch her away. "It's all right, Frankie," she said gently. "I don't belong here. Not anymore." She smiled at her then, reaching out to touch Frankie's face. "He needs me. He's calling me," she said to her with a comforting smile. Danica seemed happy then, like she knew where she belonged. "Please, no," Frankie pleaded. "Don't leave me alone now, please." Danica brushed a lock of hair from Frankie's face and smiled at her lovingly. "All of your answers are in that folder," she said. Frankie turned to the file on the chest, wondering what answers could possibly be kept in that infernal bearer of torment. Had she not already been given enough grief from it, she thought to herself. And as she thought it, she heard Danica scream in such a way that she would never forget. It sounded as though she was being dragged to the depths of hell itself. When Frankie shot back toward the sound, the darkness was still, and Danica was gone. Frankie sat on the floor of her apartment, staring at an old tattered brown file folder, weeping uncontrollably. At some point, she might even open it and look inside. Her thoughts scattered about the realization she now had to live with. All of your answers are in that folder. It repeated in her mind over and over. It was dawn before she was finally able to get a grip on her emotions, and she began to realize that the only people that had any information about the things she experienced were gone. She started to wonder then if it was all her fault. As die-hard as she had been to get her answers, now that they sat before her, she hadn't even opened the folder to seek them out. She found herself riddled with confusion and sorrow. She was in shock. Maybe she did belong locked away. She wasn't aware of how long she sat there, staring at the bulking, closed file, as though it didn't even exist. Only that she knew less about herself now than she had when she began searching for her answers. She was tired, frustrated, weary. Her struggle had brought her nothing but heartache and grief. But after everything she and others had gone through to help her, how could she stop now? She forced herself to her feet, her body heavy and tired. She was exhausted. She peeled off her clothes, one filthy article at a time. She walked to her shower. She turned on the hot water without turning on the cold, and stood in front of the mirror watching it fog up. She stared for a moment at her distorted features and wondered, was this how everyone saw her? Her thin, shoulder-length brown hair frayed and fell into her face as she yanked out the dirty tie that held it in place. Debris from the asylum walls that had clung so desperately to the locks now fell to her bare skin. Who was she? She thought to herself. Her eyes narrowed as she wiped the mist from the mirror and stared at her reflection in frustration. "I'm Frankie Welch," she said out loud. Frankie didn't start looking for answers about her origins. She started looking for answers about the Darklings, she said with resolve. She raised her chin with a new sense of self and nodded at her reflection. She stepped into the shower without having taken notice that her reflection didn't nod back. Instead, it remained where it was, peering about its glass encasement at the lights surrounding it, and then banging ferociously at it in a mad struggle to break through. Frankie simply washed herself clean of any reminders of Shady Acres, relishing the warmth of the water falling over her face. She stood there for several moments, allowing the hard rain of heat to relax her sore muscles, before turning the water off with a loud squeak. She stepped out of the shower and wrapped a towel around herself, taking another to her hair. As the towel soaked in the moisture from her hair, she couldn't help but note that the mirror was oddly free of mist. Her shower had been long enough and hot enough that the mirror should have a thick, wet coat of it. Strange, she thought, dismissing it and heading to the living area for her clothes, coffee, and the dreaded file. She simply donned a black tank top and a pair of black and pink plaid pajama pants, letting her wet hair hang loose, as she had positively no intention of leaving her home today. Comfort was a long forgotten and well-deserved luxury at this point. She stood in the kitchen sipping her coffee from her Footloose mug, her favorite cup, sporting the ever-gorgeous Ren McCormick in his white tank top and second skin blue jeans. She had her back against the counter, staring across her living room / bedroom / office at the folder laying in the middle of the floor. A new sense of determination washing suddenly over her. All of your answers are in that folder. Danica's voice repeated itself in her head. She'd lost count of how many times that very sentence haunted her since she'd left that awful place. With her free hand, she pushed herself away from the counter and headed toward the file. She heaved it up in her arm and plopped it down on the sofa, setting her coffee mug down on the transparent glass table in front of her. When she tried to open the leather tie holding the file closed, it simply crumbled and fell apart, releasing the accordion folder filled with weathered papers, cassette tapes, drawings, and dust. She pulled out her father's old tape recorder and sat back down. For a moment, she thought she heard someone scratching or scurrying through her apartment. She looked around with her brow furrowed, but saw nothing. She's just hearing things, she thought, not believing it for a moment. She decided to focus herself and ignore the noises for now. She popped open the recorded door and inserted a cassette marked February 18th, 1969, Therapy Session 1, Danica E. Bathory. She pushed play and listened intently as the static sliced through the silence. The date is March 21st, 1970. This is Dr. Edwin Haskins. Therapy session number 1, patient's name, Danica Elizabeth Bathory, age 27 years, Caucasian female. Danica, my dear, would you mind stepping away from the lamp and joining me here? His voice sounded quite veteran. She pictured a man with white hair balding on top, a beard and mustache gently kept, maybe a pair of thick glasses to complete the image. His voice was very calming, comforting, almost like Dr. Anderson's voice, but deeper, more weathered. I need the light. Danica's voice came. She sounded panicked. Her breath fell heavy and uneven, full of fear. That's quite all right, dear. You see, there is a lamp right here beside the chair. Would you like me to turn it on for you? He was kind. It seemed he genuinely wanted to help her. Yes, yes, please. The panicked voice of Danica Bathory seemed to calm then. Her breath seemed to slow and steady itself as a switch clicked. Only then did Frankie hear Danica's breath draw closer to the recorder. She heard the fabric of a chair rustle and settle, and then the doctor spoke. There now, isn't that better, my dear? It must be more comfortable than crouching there in the corner. Yes, thank you. Danica's voice came. So, Haskins began in a soft tone. Danica Bathory. That's quite a profound name. Any relation to the great countess? He asked. His tone was even, soft and reassuring. Indeed, he reminded her of Dr. Anderson, just a more veteran, gruff version of it. Danica, he repeated. There was only static for a few moments. Yes. Danica's voice fell reluctantly. She's my grandmother. 4 or 5 times great, I'm assuming, the doctor chuckled lightly when he said it. Danica did not reply. Haskins cleared his throat and continued the session. With a family history like that, I imagine you've had a lot of unwanted attention, yes? The remark hung in the air like fog, thick and heavy. It would be several moments before he would get a response from her. Some was the only reply to his query. It was as though she were far away somewhere. Even over a recorded conversation, Frankie could tell that Danica was in the room with Haskins, and yet she was not. Would you care to discuss it? Haskins asked. There was a long pause then. Frankie noted the heaviness of the atmosphere surrounding the conversation. She found it rather chilling that she could sense it, or even over a tape recording. She could have been standing in the room with them. She made a promise to someone. Danica said in a tone so quiet she could barely be heard. One she had no right to make. She finished. What promise is that, Danica? His question was once more met with a drawn silence before Danica met him with a reply. Her descendants was the only answer she gave him. Would you care to elaborate on that, my dear? Haskins asked kindly. No, she responded abruptly. Haskins noted her tone and moved on. Your file says you're pregnant. Congratulations, he said. Frankie could hear the smile in his voice as he said it. And there was a long silence then, and heaviness once again fell over the atmosphere. This is a good thing, is it not, Miss Danica? His sweet, comforting voice hinted now at concern. It has to be a boy, she responded, her voice breathy now as though she were frightened. He won't take it if it's a boy. The father? Haskins asked. Just silence. Why, Miss Danica? Why wouldn't the father want the child if it's a boy? Again, only silence. She could hear him sit forward in his chair. Danica, dear, you must understand I can't help you if you don't talk to me. And I want to help you. I want you to be able to leave this place and raise your child. Haskins paused only for a moment. The man that brought you here, Mr. Kurt Janus, is he the father? He was answered with a loud clap and hysterical laughter from Danica. No, no, she replied, still chuckling a bit. I've known Kurt since we were kids. He's like my brother. He isn't. Her voice trailed off then into silence. Danica, dear. Haskins' voice held traces of uncertainty now as he spoke gently to her. Can you tell me who the father is? The ensuing silence was long. Static cracked over the speaker like a campfire spitting and popping. Frankie began to wonder if the tape were finished, and then the answer broke through the silence. Millard Vifit, Danica whispered in a frightened tone. The terror in her voice was more than evident as she said the name. Frankie quickly picked up her laptop and did a search for this Millard Vifit. The results returned no leads. And then something happened. Frankie couldn't tell what it was, but there was something clearly happening in the room. Danica, calm down, dear. It's all right. You're safe here. She heard Haskins' voice growing in earnest and pure worry. Danica. Danica began to scream and weep. He comes in the dark. It's the dark. He's the dark. She screamed in horror between sobs. I need the orderlies now. Now, Haskins shouted at the silence. Frankie simply sat there for a while, staring down at the tape recorder. Danica Bathory. Her mother. He's the dark. She had to wonder exactly what she meant by that, but a different thought was plaguing her now. She sat waiting, the latte in her hand cooling gradually as she stared out the window of the small cafe. 10 minutes late, she thought. Typical. She heaved a sigh and raised an eyebrow when she saw the mint green Chrysler pull up in front of the cafe. Dane stepped out, holding his keys by their ring on his index finger as he slammed the door shut and adjusted his sunglasses. Every female head on the block whipped in his direction to admire him head to toe. Frankie just rolled her eyes and waited for him to come in and sit down. He went to the counter first, asking the young smitten woman for his regular. She gave him a giggle, twirled her finger in her hair, and turned to prepare his usual order. Quad shot mocha raspberry. Dane always did appreciate caffeine to a fine degree. Frankie smirked, watching the love-struck blonde make his coffee. He handed her a generous tip and his card before turning to the table to sit down. Is there anything you won't do to get laid, Dane? Frankie asked in her most sarcastic tone. He adjusted his blazer and gave her a light grin. So what's the deal? What's so important that we had to meet up today? He asked in his usual carefree tone. The look on Frankie's face made him pause for a moment. He could see something in her eyes that he hadn't ever seen before. Something had changed her. "What's going on, Frankie? Talk to me." He took off his glasses as he said it, his eyes blue as the ocean, peering right into her. She'd always found comfort there, in his eyes. They had always somehow made her feel safe. He always made her feel safe. She swallowed hard, unsure of what she was doing, unsure if she should even mention it, but she had to know. "Did you?" She hesitated. "Spit it out, girl," Dane said with a chuckle. She just looked at him, her eyes like those of a fawn that had lost its way, his brow furrowed with worry. "Spit it out," he said again, softer this time. She stared at him for a moment, trying to grip onto the courage to say it out loud. "Did you know I was adopted, Dane?" Somehow the words came out easier than she expected them to. Dane sat back in the booth, his weight heaving against the cushions in an unusually thick way. His hands found his face and he ran down it in a manner of suggesting relief, as did the breath he released in a long, heavy sigh. It was as though he had waited for her to say those exact words for an eternity, and yet hoped she wouldn't. For a moment he just stared at the ceiling, his hands still lingering at his chin before slipping them to his thighs and sitting forward again, his elbows on the table. "How'd you find out?" he asked quietly. "Doesn't matter." "I guess you're right," he replied, twiddling his thumbs and staring as she spun her cup. It took him a few minutes before he could say what it was he wanted to. "When I was born," he started, leaning back and slinging his arm over the back of the booth seat. His eyes were still pinned to the table as he spoke. "Tore Mom up pretty bad, I guess. After me, she couldn't have kids anymore. She and Dad, they always wanted 2 kids, a boy and a girl. So they decided to adopt." He stopped then, uncertain if he should continue. She wasn't sure if she should be angry or sad. She was a bit of both and didn't know how to express it. "Go on," she said, choking back a confusing mixture of emotions that bordered on overwhelming. It was true. All of it was true. How was she supposed to feel now? "Look, Frankie, She cut him off then. "Please, Dane. Just please," she said in earnest. Dane sighed again, pursing his lips and trying to find the right words. "Mom and Dad got a call one day, and we all went to pick you up. I was sitting in this chair, listening to the adults talk. I didn't even know where we were. It looked like a church, had all these chairs and crosses all over, Dane was talking with his hands. It was always a sure sign that he was uncomfortable, nervous. Anyway, all I remember from what I overheard was that they said your mom was, He hesitated then and met her eyes. "Tell me," she said softly. He bit the inside of his cheek and nervously scratched his head. They said that your mom was in a mental institution. That's all I remember about that day." Frankie closed her eyes, silently accepting her new truth. It was a confirmation that she needed. All there was to know, all there was to do now was reopen the folder filled with Danica Bathory's life and sink deeper into her madness. She opened her eyes slowly when she felt Dane's hands on her own. Look, Frankie, it doesn't matter who our parents are. It doesn't matter where you or I came from. You're my baby sister. You always have been. You always will be. And nothing in this world, not even DNA, will ever change that. I am always going to be your brother. Always. He kissed her hands and then looked at her gently. She always felt safe there.